So, Edgar asked if I could give a small introduction to Runebearer, and I realized, oh yeah, I've been talking about, doing this solo campaign in Runebearer, and we've done some AARs and so on, and to some degree, I've just mostly assumed um, that you know, people might be familiar or not care one way or the other. so, um, but that's a bad assumption. Let's talk about let's talk about Runebearer. Runebearer is a game that I wrote in the latter half of the '90s. I don't know the exact year when this thing sort of became a mess. That is 2003, but that is actually well after. So the actual first draft of these rules came about late '90s, I think. And I'd been playing a lot of Hero System. That was sort of my game of choice at that time. I used it all throughout the latter half of high school, um, and ran that alongside like first edition D&D. But Hero had essentially taken over, for superhero games and for even fantasy games and so on. How one of the a super early game. I ran a science fiction game back in high school using the old espionage rules before they even had science fiction rules. We sort of cobbled that together with Traveler. So I've been playing Hero for a very very long time, um, and I'd used it for a super successful science fiction game in the late part of college called the Local Group, and used it for a lot of fantasy. And indeed, at this point in time, I had sort of revived an idea that was tragically named Bostonia, but it stuck, and I'm sticking with it. And that campaign was effectively the northeast of the United States, and it was a cross between sort of like a Dark Tower and Shannara and Thundar the Barbarian, sort of post-apocalyptic a little bit, but more dark fantasy and more swords and sorcery with sort of an underpinning of yeah, but what if this was all Earth after it was destroyed, right? Certainly not a new or unique concept in fantasy, pretty old hat, right? The Again, I grew up watching Thundar the Barbarian on Saturday afternoons, Saturday mornings. I mean, so the idea, of course, is that the world was ravaged by destructive powers. It was the late '90s, so I was a child of the '80s, so nukes. Because damn it, Reagan promised me by now I'd be roaming the desert in my dune buggy in a thong and with a shotgun. Like I don't know how we could not have kept that promise. But yeah, the world was ravaged by weapons, and that released energies into the universe, which could be thought of as magic, would be the idea. And the society as we know it's been destroyed, and it's been replaced by this other thing. It wasn't Gamma Worldy. That was another game that I played a lot in the '80s. In the Gamma world was very science fiction forward, right, and was sort of campy about it. But this was more Conan with a nod to the fact that the world was a different, was built on the ruins of a different world. So, so that was sort of the premise of the campaign world. And actually, the strange part is one of the problems I always thought of the game was that once players sort of knew that, and they could have known it because that might have been the elevator pitch to which I sold them. Then they spent a lot of mental energy trying to figure it out. Oh, what is this building, or what is this device? Is this a Xerox machine? Do I need that kind of thing? And it wasn't that I was upset with them trying to figure things out. It was more that it was sort of a pointless exercise, right? So I leaned away from trying to make it recognizable and focused more on the ancient stuff just being weird and unpredictable, right? It is what I say it is. a wizard did it. And that's sort of how the idea has morphed a bit. So yeah, so we were using Fantasy Hero to do that style of game. And at some point I got a little bit disenchanted with the hero system for the magic in the game. Um, Hero's great. It does a great job of being a superhero physics engine. Um, it is decent with balance in the sense that, you buy your powers with points, and in theory, this many points in this power is equal to this many points in another power. It's mostly balanced for game effects. Um, and spells could mix and match game effects and so on. But, it turns out that once you apply it to like magic, it turns out that interesting spells become way too expensive for their cost in hero, and very dull spells become very cost effective for what they do. So like mixing effects, like creating a web that slowly poisons your enemies, would actually be very expensive versus just firing a flash and blinding everybody on the opposing side, or drains. And part of the reason is simply that, from a game logic perspective, a lot of characters had defenses against these sorts of powers in a superhero game, but not a lot of folks would reasonably have defenses against those kinds of powers in a fantasy game. And the concepts of like saving throws and so on didn't exist, right? Um, the wizard had to cast their magic and had to hit, potentially. But even that's easy to work around in Hero, and and all the barbarians then just get zapped, and there's all ways against that, and you could definitely change the powers up and so on. But ultimately, even with all of that, which you can do, you can take limitations on powers to give them saving throws and so on and so forth. Ultimately, I'd always felt that the more interesting a spell got, the harder it became to actually put it into hero terms and make it cost a reasonable amount. Whereas it was always just a better call to do damage or to disable your enemies in the most efficient way possible. So that was sort of the impetus of making a game. And the first game was actually Bostonia FRP, I think is what it was called. And the idea was to keep some of the good parts of Hero. We always like the combat, we like the action economy of Hero, the skill based, point based. We liked package deals, and so we kept them in the form of templates. Armor and wounds and bleeding, like all those things worked out really well in Fantasy Hero, and I certainly wanted to keep them. But I wanted something that more closely emulated the magic system I wanted to have, and we'll talk about that. And then I wanted to toss some of the parts that did not work quite as well. Things like phases and speed and stun and endurance and long-term endurance and spell balance being out of whack. Like all those things were things I said, well, Hero's great, but I don't know that it works for this style of game with the magic as I want it. And maybe we can cut some of that back. And I wanted to use D12s because I had a ton of them and didn't do anything with them. And 12 is such a good number, being divisible by 2 and 6 and 3 and 4. And, I wanted to roll more as a GM. So that's sort of where that was sort of all those things, because for the longest time I was like, yeah, I just need to play Hero and I'm good. Like I'm good forever. Like we could just play this for, but I think ultimately it just ended up that we'd played for dozen plus years the same game. And at some point, I think you get tired of playing that game and you start thinking, well, what else can we do? And this was that. So the initial Bostonia was the initial Runebearer. The very first Runebearer was a bit of a mess. I mean, you had oops, I got all kinds of documents in here that aren't you had like 10 stats and then figured stats. And oh yeah, they're right there, right? Strength, agility, dexterity, speed, toughness, intelligence, wisdom, willpower, I should say, charisma, spirit, and perception. Like you had a ton of stats. You had like just everything was very clunky. You had a super clunky wound system and a super clunky encumbrance system. Um, even calculating all your figured stats required you to tally up two or three other scores, and so I think all of it was pretty clean. And it, by the way, it was fine. It was great. We played the hell out of it, and we had a lot of good times with it. But and boy, these fonts suck because I don't have, this is Google Docs, so it doesn't actually do much with formatting the doc. But we had a great time with it. But ultimately, it was just a mess. The fourth version of the game, like the version that we are going to ultimately play and see, is indeed a cut down, streamlined, slightly more modern version. I think without giving up on some of the core bits that I feel very important about. And there's actually several games, by the way, that fall under this rough umbrella. There's the Bostonia game, Runebearer proper, the game we're going to go over. There's Sword Sphere, which is a different, slightly different flavor of this game, which is more powers buildy, and then the superhero game that falls under the same auspices as Runebearer. But we're going to talk about Bostonia because that's sort of what's relevant here. But at some point, maybe we get a glimpse into those games too in the coming months. And yeah, so I would even say, even the modern version, if you gave me a who's this for, somewhere I have the character creation docs. Here we go. Like if you gave me a who the hell's this game for, I would say nobody. It's for me. Like it's literally, my personal preferences writ large, kind of in game form. I would argue though that you may enjoy it if you like the 80s aesthetics of RPGs, that 80s era of RPG, the slightly heavy, comprehensive simulationist RPG, things like Hero System, GURPS, Jaroon, Aftermath, Twilight 2000, Rollmaster. Like it is definitely in that ilk. That is the game that I played for all of my childhood throughout my young adulthood. That is the game I am going to die with, effectively. That era of game. If you're looking for a lighter narrative, powered by the apocalypse, masks, kind of game, this is not that game. It has some of that built in because I do think, right, we take ideas as we find them. But yeah, this rule set isn't going to do it for you. It's going to be super clunky, and combat's going to last too long and be too complicated, and so on. It is definitely for the crowd of folks that, as my buddy Scott likes to put it, I want an RPG wrapped around my hardcore man-to-man fantasy wargaming rules set. That's what the game is. It's a little lighter than that, I think, but that's what it is at its core. It is a fantasy combat simulator with an RPG wrapped around it. And we essentially just we temper that just on the fly as humans by either focusing on combat for a session or focusing on the other stuff for a session. Like it's not in the rules. It's not baked in the rules. It's just part of the comings and goings of a campaign. So let's talk about character creation. So character creation, Runebearer now has 7 stats. I don't really have a character sheet per se, but I do have the characters that I made somewhere. And I mean, that's not a great character sheet per se, but it is sort of a character sheet. And you can see most of what you need to see, right? There we go. Hopefully it's clear on the channel. So Runebearer has 7 stats. There are 3 physical stats, 3 mental stats. There's 1 in-betweener stat. Essentially, you have muscle, skill, and toughness, wit, power, and charisma, and then in between there's awareness, which used to be called reflex, and so you will see them used interchangeably in different games. And if I slip and say make a reflex save, it really is an awareness save um, in the current version of the game. These are roughly 3 to 18, or 0 to 20. In super extreme cases, they can go higher than 20, but it's 0 to 20 being sort of a human range. And then you have pretty, I would call OSR like modifiers on those stats. And what do I mean by that? I mean this guy, or this table right here, right? Where 13 to 15 is a +1, 16 and 17 are +2, etc. One of the main differences is there's an effect die, quote unquote. So, for instance, your muscle, when you hit something, that's how much damage you're going to do. Your toughness, that's how much damage you get to shake off after a fight, is based on that effect die. And you can roll, or you can use a stat array. Because stats are so important, because stats are fairly important, and you hate to see one guy get a crappy character, another guy get a great character, especially because I feel that rolling stats works really well in games where you're just not sure if the character is going to survive for an hour. And then you just roll up a new one and start over. And when you get that sort of lucky set of rolls and that guy lives, that's awesome. And that's part of what makes that guy amazing is, oh, he lived and and when you get the unlucky guy and he lives, that's sort of weirdly amazing. In a game where you don't expect death around every corner, and to some degree, at least in the game we run now, death is highly unlikely. It just, people want to get used to that's one place where we break from like the OSR model, is that where we go, I don't care if characters die. Like, we want characters to be around. We want this to be a soap opera a little bit, and that requires recurring characters. So to that end, I always say let's just use an array so that the stats can be vaguely equal at start, and you know what you're getting. There are figured stats. So hit points are figured from your toughness, muscle, and power, your wound number, base defense, dodge, and your movement, etc. Like, there's a bunch of that that we figure out, and those are used in combat. That's very much ties back to our hero system roots a little bit. You get 55 points to spend, and you're required to pick a template. Now, what's a template? A template is a package deal. And 55, we played it fast and loose when we made our 2 characters for the solo game, because it's going to be 2 characters. The game is sort of devised around 4-ish players, typically. In our game, we have 8 on a given night. So, totally different games, by the way. With 2, it's going to be tight. Like, combats are, going to be harder to balance. And so having a few more skills covered, I think, is going to be fine. But you get 55 points, and you'll see these templates here. They carry a bunch of skills with them and a bunch of powers with them, and they spend usually between 20 and 40 of your points. Some spend, like, it's typically between 30 and 40. Some of them spend only 25, for instance. 36, right? So, and what they do is they give you a number of skills which you have to take. You cannot break from the template unless the GM gives you explicit permission because because whatever, because you had an idea. They also might give you talents, which would be powers. They also might give you um, special combat abilities that no one else has. So, as a for instance, you see the Sunbringer here. They get a bunch of skills, but they also get +4 hit points, and they get to use medium armor. Not that using medium armor is that much of a power, but they do get a talent which they choose amongst Bone Bleeder, In the Noonday Sun, Sunbringer lore, right? Those are all different powers. Undead Slayer gives you bonus against undead. Bone Bleeder lets you actually do wounds to undead that normally don't take wounds, which is sort of interesting. And then down here, you see things like Weapon Shield, and you go, well, that's not very special. It is because for the Sunbringers, their shield is based on their willpower. So literally, their skill for shield, because of their holy priests, of course, that fight the undead, that gives them this different skill. They learned a different technique, and that's sort of how we do different combat techniques. The duplicitous lord, the nobles of House Vincent, have a weapon skill which is basically using improvised things like needles and other household implements to kill, because they may just want to poison a sewing needle or a candlestick and then assassinate you with it. And sort of that's how they roll. So they can actually use that as a weapon to very good effect. And so the point of templates was twofold. One was to make character creation quicker. Instead of you just sitting over and just mulling over all of your skill choices, you're forced to take one of these. It's going to spend 40 of your points. Now all of a sudden you only have to choose like 5 things because you've already gotten 2/3 of your character spent. And that actually is, I found, to be amazingly helpful. Once you choose the vibe you want, then you're just left with, oh, I have 20 points left. I can just boom, boom, buy 6 skills and so on and so forth, right? So it's very helpful in that respect. And the other thing is, it implies a lore. Like the templates imply lore. Like you're now tied to the world in some very specific way because you're in the Engineers Guild, or you were in the Engineers Guild, or you were a Sunbringer, or you are a White Raven mercenary or whatever, right? And those all sort of lend themselves to a certain vibe and a certain set of stories and so on. So I love the templates, and that's what we need. We need 100 more of these in there. It's also the only way to get abilities at the start. Like, you can't buy abilities. And that's something that maybe we'll talk about. I don't know if we'll get that far, but maybe we'll talk about it, in that part of the point of this version of the game is to slow that power curve down to something closer to a first edition D&D than, say, a 5th edition D&D, where 5th edition ramps up the power curve really quick. You start as heroes and you end as superheroes, and in 1st edition you start as very weak nobodies and then end up as pretty darn powerful heroes. And I was trying to lean toward the first, and one of the things I think that causes power creep quickly is free access to feats, free access to breaking the rules. And so a lot of what we've done here is make those talents, which are our version of feats in Runebearer, only accessible in a couple ways. The first way is through templates, through your special sauce of what character you started with. And as the campaign goes on, I give people lists based on things which have happened in the campaign and go, you can pick one of these and you guys can decide who gets what. And that doling out of feats definitely keeps that power. It not only makes the feats more impactful because they're sort of tied to things people have done or the group has done, um, but it also keeps the power level ramping at a very constant rate that I can sort of control with a knob. And it actually is very much like the concept of magic items in first edition D&D, which like that was your set of source of powers originally was just the items you found, unless you're a mage or a cleric, of course. But for fighters and thieves and a whole host of characters, it was the items you found were your feats, were your powers, and thus the GM could dole those out cleverly to make the power curve ramp up as he wanted to. There aren't that many magic items in Vostonia and Runebearer, so we have powers, just outright talents that you can get, but we can dole them out with a little bit of judicious, with a little thought ahead of time. The other thing about templates, sorry, that was a diversion. The other thing about templates is that every skill in that template, you get a +2. You get a bonus to using that skill because you were trained in it. It's part of your template. And this offsets the sort of cheesy min-max of going and taking a very, very low point template so that you get point, like everybody takes Guild Engineer so that they get 30 points to spend versus taking, a Shield Guild Captain, which is spend 42 of your points. You have less choices as a Shield Guild Captain, but everything you take in here, you're going to get a +2 to use. That's sort of the idea. And that's actually a pretty significant bonus in the game because we use a bell curve. So a +2 actually does shift you quite a bit. Skills. So we have a big old skill list. It's not gigantic, but and I think that's okay. I would love more skills because I always love more skills, but we have a bunch of skills. This is sort of what they look like on your character sheet. Administrate. I'm not going to go over all the skills. That would be silly. But administrate is running a business or running a group or paying the bills every month, right? It is based on 2 attributes. In this case, charisma and wit. All skills start at an 8. Base value is an 8. This is what goes up when you get experience. When you level up a skill, base value goes from 8 to 9, 9 to 10, 10 to 11. You also add the stat modifiers from your 2 stats. So in this case, wit and charisma. So he gets a +2 here, Martin, I should say. And since this was in his template, he gets another +2, which means that he starts at what is fairly high, a fairly good stat, final value of 12. That's sort of what I expect to see. So yeah, you get your base, you get your bonus from your 2 stats, you get a bonus from your template or not. That gives you a final value. And there are also things I call umbrella skills. Knowledge is one, language is another one, profession is another one, survival is sort of one. And what that means is, so for knowledge, you essentially have a skill, in this case knowledge, you have sub-skills, and using any of these gives you experience in the big main skill, and they essentially all go up together. That is not realistic per se, that has nothing to do with simulation. That's just more gamey in the sense that, if someone takes profession tailor and cobbler and carpenter, and they have a bunch of professions, the chance that they're going to use all those throughout your game, unless your game's about that, is fairly low. And so this just encourages people to still take those sub skills and flesh their character out without penalizing them, right? So, the sub skills are very cheap compared to the main skill. So knowledge costs 3. You get 1 sub skill for free. So knowledge of other alchemists is 3 points. but then reagent sources is a single point, noble houses is another point, and then anytime you use any of these, you get experience to make them all go up. So there's a few of those skills that sort of cover a lot. And like I said, I don't think it has anything to do with simulation of anything as much as it does just from a game perspective. Typically, you're not going to use those skills as often as you use the other skills, but we also want those skills to progress and go up. And then you have talents, and talents they're effectively feats in your D&D 3 or D&D 5th edition or Pathfinder. They're your feats, and like I said, Martin doesn't have any. I don't know that our other character Rorik has any either. I think he maybe just the hit points or whatever. But we will get access to those as the game progresses, and we complete an adventure. One of the rewards might be, hey, someone can take a talent. Here's the talent you get to choose from, and that's sort of how we give those out. The basic mechanics of the game are actually amazingly simple. Once you have completed your little grid of skills here, then pretty much any skill check is an opposed skill check. If I want to trade, I'm going to compare my trade to the other merchant's trade, and we're both going to roll a d12, and whoever rolls higher wins. Every skill check is like that in the game. If you're not competing against someone else, if you're just trying to make a potion, then you're competing against the difficulty of that potion. Let's say they're tier 1 potions, so they start at a 10 difficulty. The GM rolls and adds a 10 to his D12. You roll and add 11 to your D12. Higher roll wins. That's literally the entire damn game. The GM rolls against you every time because I like rolling against folks every time. And there can be degrees of success like we do. There's different things that have a degree of success or a degree of failure. Rolling a 1 sucks, but there's no, but the base game is very much, we both roll a 12-sided die and add a number, and who rolled higher. That's the whole game. That's what I'll be doing the entire time. Makes a nice bell curve. It's a pretty swingy bell curve. I've thought about that a lot, but I've decided over the course of time to just keep it as is. It is, -11 to +11 is quite a bit, but it's worked, and I think it's fine. Saving throws are the same. So saving throws are against stats. So I might ask, if you're stuck in a tricky, sticky web, I might go, Martin, make a muscle save. He rolls a d12 and he adds 10. I roll a d12 and add the difficulty. Who rolls higher? Done. There's a lot of toughness saves, power saves, and awareness checks. Toughness would be for poison. Power would be for like mind-altering effects. Awareness might be a trap. Muscle and wit might be, illusions and you're tied up. And probably charisma and skill checks are probably the least common, but they do occasionally occur. I was thinking of putting some type of spells or something that had a little bit more charisma check. And so on. We have a couple meta currencies. Well, we have one meta currency. We have inspiration. Everybody gets 2 to start unless you were inspired, because that's a talent. Unless you get the talent, most Templars have it. You get 3 inspiration if you're one of those, which is actually a big deal, by the way. And it's a reroll of anything that you want to reroll. So a saving throw or a skill check, you can reroll it. Or make, right? Or if you're hit by an attack, you can re-roll with inspiration. There's also sort of anti-inspiration, so to speak, called fatigue, and you get that over the course of your day when you're wearing heavy armor or carrying a lot of stuff. I might make you make a fatigue check against your fatigue number, and then if you fail it, you get a red chip, So we use white poker chips for inspiration and red poker chips for fatigue. And if you have fatigue in front of you, the GM can go, "Oh, you succeeded. Here, I'll take that fatigue. You need to roll again." And again, part of the game is just there's a little bit of antagonist GM sort of vibe, but not a ton. I mean, ultimately, I want the characters to win and everybody to have a good time. But the game kind of wants me to play that antagonist game a little bit, so I do cackle a lot and taunt them. But it's fine. It's fine. No one, it's perfectly fine. But yeah, like if most of the game you're going to be like just go, okay, what's the big deal? Because it literally is just going to be me rolling and adding one of these numbers and then rolling against that and checking that and going forward. We're going to be doing that a lot. As you succeed in skills, so if you succeed an administrative check, you get a check that in the skill. Oh man, okay, yeah. I don't like that they take forever to go. Right, you get a check. I'm putting a check mark. I'm putting a circle there, and then that's how we roll experiences. As you get checks, you roll to convert the checks. We'll talk about that specifically, but as you use skills, you get checks in them to raise them. Combat is where we take the most nowadays out of Hero. Combat is very much based. The action economy is based very much on the hero system economy. And we probably should strangely change it simply because it's a little outdated, but we're keeping it. We're keeping it for now. So what that means is that every round is 3 to 5 seconds. Every hex is 2 meters, and you get in your turn. You can take a single full action or 2 half actions. So in reality, you get 2 actions, but right? And and some things cost 2 actions, that kind of thing, right? It's actually very common to a lot of systems you'll see today in like XCOM and on the computer where you have 2 actions, or you can use 3 actions or whatever. In this case, you got 2. You get 2 halves. And then things that take half actions are moving half of your move, attacking, drawing a weapon or putting something away, opening a door, standing up from being prone, right? All that is a half action. And a full action will be running your entire move or sprinting, breaking out of a hold, opening a stuck door, untying a knot. Done. Like that's it. You either do 2 things or you do 1 thing, pretty much, each round. We roll initiative. It's by person initiative. You add an initiative score to it, which is your awareness and I think wit modifiers added together. So D12 plus your initiative score. Ties are resolved simply by how important you are in the pecking order of characters, meaning that archvillains and bosses and named enemy lieutenants go first because I'm a jerk. PCs go second, enemy minions go third, and then like non-combatants go last, if in case of ties. I think the goal of combat is to make a relatively crunchy miniatures man-to-man fantasy war game where positioning and teamwork matter over builds. And we don't have like a lot of builds in Runebearer. This version of Runebearer, there are versions that do builds. This is not that version. It's a mapped affair. We have miniatures, we have maps, we have a vinyl mat, and we draw on it with the vis-a-vis markers. Like I said, initiatives per combatant. We keep initiative round to round, but there are currencies you can spend to force a reroll of initiative. So inspiration is one. So at the beginning of And you can do this, and this is actually a good thing to do, in sort of critical moments or whatever, right? You know, you're going last in a round. The evil wizard is ready to get his spell off next round. You could re-roll initiative, so maybe you beat him and go first before he gets his spell off. That kind of thing. Um, and any of the combatants can do it. Now, mind you, only the PCs typically have those resources until you get to lieutenants and bosses and the enemies. They might have inspiration as well, and they might be able to call for that too. So there's sort of, right, there's different classes of enemies, and the putzier ones, I mean, they're not there to steal the show, right? The PCs are going to have the resources. But if you get to the boss or the named boss or whatever, they might have inspiration too, and they might be able to spend against you. So yeah, action economy is based on hero, like I said, 2 half actions. There's a bunch of goofy rules on moving and saving and all that, right? There are zones of control. So if you occupy a hex, all the hexes around you, people have to stop when they enter your zone of control. If they try to move past your zone of control, you get an attack of opportunity effectively. Same thing if they try to leave your zone of control. Unless you have some condition that allows you to leave the zone of control, up to and including having one of your guys be able to distract the foe. Attacking is an opposed roll between your attack skill and their defense skill. So much like every other roll in the game, it is an opposed roll. Now, keep in mind that one thing we have is you have multiple defenses. So, for instance, you have a parry, a block, and a dodge. Now, parry is your weapon. You parry with your weapon. Every weapon has a set of stats. Some are good for parrying, some are terrible for parrying. It's your weapon skill modified by the weapon's parry value. Block is shields. Shields are generally good for blocking. Shields can block missile attacks, whereas parrying can only block melee attacks. Dodge can defend against any kind of attack, but it's typically your worst of those 3. So what this means is shields are pretty darn powerful for various reasons. Well, I jumped ahead. So as you use your attack, your defenses, they go down by -3, unless you have talents or some other ability. But so, for instance, if you have a 12 skill and you parry, your skill now for the next parry is 9, and the parry after that is 6. So it quickly gets crappy. So you quickly get to a spot where you might want to parry one attack, dodge the second attack, and then parry the third attack. Or you might get into a situation where if you're a sword and board guy, I parry the first attack and then block the second with my shield, or vice versa. Because all of those go down separately. So shields become very powerful. And the difference between a 2-handed weapon and a 1-handed shield is very offensive versus very defensive. The 2-handed guy is going to do more damage, absolutely, but have way worse defenses and be able to tank way fewer enemies. Because as people gang up on you, they are stacking those penalties on you. And even the weakest kobold or goblin or whatever, enough of them can start to wear down your defenses to where they're starting to get hits. After 2 or 3 attacks, they're getting hits. So positioning is important. Not being able to be surrounded and flanked by multiple opponents is important. Not overextending into the enemy's line is important. All of those things are very critical and sort of make the game make the game a little more, I'd say thoughtful. That sounds a little pretentious, I think, but positioning does matter. we have one of our ladies. She wants to jump in the middle of the fight, but and has done so several times. But then, and typically she's very good, but she will then get overwhelmed because she's overextended, and the rest of the group can't get to her in enough time to save her from the counter attack of 3 or 4 enemies. And so, so again, it's much better if she sticks with the group and tries to use the terrain and her buddies to avoid that. Anyway, there's a lot of maneuvers you can do too. You can do position shots. There's our wound effects, which we'll get to when we actually play. But yeah, there's a bunch of maneuvers. So I can, if I outclass an enemy, maybe I do a strong strike and do extra damage. If I'm overwhelmed, maybe I will give ground or all-out dodge or all-out block so that I can soak some attacks for my friends to take the attack, to attack, to counterattack. So we have maneuvers, we've got aim shots, we've got wounds and and so on. It's a relatively crunchy system, and what you will see when we play, there's a lot of dice rolling. Fortunately, I don't mind. My players typically don't mind. I do know some people would go, you have to roll like 6 times for something, and be like, yeah, this isn't the game for you. There's a lot of rolls. Sorry. Heck, there's even things that then proc, and different weapons actually have different powers that cause them to proc stuns or bleeds and so on if they hit certain locations. So, so that's going to be awkward for some folks. And here's our weapon list. So yeah, you'll see Mace has concussion 4. Well, what's concussion 4? Concussion 4 means if you hit the target in the head, you have an X in 12 chance of stunning him. If you have an axe and you have limb breaker, if you hit the arm or the leg, you do an extra point of damage, like that kind of stuff, right? There's a lot of that. Certain armors are good against certain weapons and so on. Like, it is a reasonably crunchy combat system. I hope that doesn't put you guys off. I can probably run it fast enough so that you won't notice so much. I hope. We'll see. That's one of the fears I actually have, is that you all walk away going, God, that guy's game is shit. So, and maybe you do. I don't know. It's this getting a little long. Let's talk about Magic last, and then we'll just move on from we'll figure out if we need another one of these if anybody has any other questions, right? So Magic is sort of the funny part is Magic was the reason the game was created in the first place, is to make a Magic system that sort of jived more with what I wanted than what I had in Hero when we were playing before. And so Magic in Bostonia is not a scholarly affair. It is very much there's a little bit of scholarly lore involved in that you have to find where you can attain the power of these runes. The game's called Runebearer, so there you go. And there's a little bit of lore there where you have to go, well, to get this rune, I have to go here and do this and talk to this guy, and this is the binding ritual that I need to undertake. But yeah, runes are typically acquired at rune sites of elemental power. That's not everything for everyone. We have one in the game right now. It's a mask. That's the rune. You put the mask on, you can use the magical power. You take it off and you lose that ability for X amount of time. But yeah, they're all different. And then each rune has some kind of binding ritual or test that you must partake in to gain it, to bind it, to subject it to your will. Runes are typically mark your body. They are effectively tattoos, but they can be more than tattoos. Some of them fork your tongue. Other ones make your blood glow like lava. Some are just plain old tattoos, literally the first equation of the mathematician is the physics cheat sheet on your arm. It's it's the equation. The first equation of the mathematicians is the equation on their arm. But yeah, so it's not really a scholarly thing in all cases. It is very much a willpower, desire. How crazy are you? And to some degree, I think mages in Bostonia are all crazy in one way or another. So yeah, you would go to the site, test yourself against the rune. If you fail, then you suffer the consequences, and some of that might be deadly. So Hand of Lightning, for instance, you take a special brand, and there's only 2 or 3 of them in the world, and you put it against your chest and go to the highest hill and electrocute yourself with it by waiting for a storm. And it's literally like a lightning rod attached to a brand that you attach to your chest. If you live, you get the power, and if you don't, well, you didn't. And that's sort of what it is. And so obviously there's a little bit of, if you know how to prep for these things, you might up your chances for survival. But binding a rune is often a dangerous and potentially deadly sort of thing. Once you get a rune, it is just a skill. So, for instance, you might have first equation of the mathematicians. Okay, you have that it's a base level of 8, and you get a plus X based on your stats, and so on, and you have a 10. There you go. And then every spell has a difficulty to cast. You roll against it, an opposed roll. Done. There you go. If you succeed, you cast the spell. There's no mana in Runebearer. Instead, if you fail to cast or only succeed by a little bit, you burn levels of your rune. So let's say you start with a 10 and then you succeed, but you just succeed. Well, then your skill goes down to a 9 for the rest of the day. And that makes the later spells harder to cast. They're going to burn more, and so on. There's different ways to avoid the skill loss. You can burn your hit points instead. So mages can kill themselves casting spells by, right? Oh man, I failed by 9. Jesus, that's 3 skill levels. 3 skill levels. What am I going to do? You could also burn 9 hit points. Now, the average character has 28 hit points. So you could take a third of your health away to keep your level up and keep casting, even though you have failed in casting spells. So what happens is typically mages slowly burn down their level until it's unfeasible to cast their higher level spells, then unfeasible to cast their mid-level spell, and so on and so forth, right? And that way they sort of trickle down. And you gain those at night, and this is different nowadays. This is slightly different, but that's okay. We'll go fix that later. At night, you gain so many spell levels back. You can then also meditate to get more back. You can take certain herbs and so on to get more back. Some spells automatically cost you. They're called fatigue. So if they fatigue or expend, you must burn levels. And investiture is worse. Investiture is a permanent loss of levels. And typically we use fatigue. And I'll tell you what I use fatigue for. So keep in mind that these, where am I? So keep in mind that these are not extensive spell lists, right? The Hand of Lightning, right, gives you right now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 spells at first tier, and a few more as we go up, and so on, right? So it's not gigantic spell lists. They're very closer to focus lists of power, and typically, a mage is going to have 1 or 2, maybe 3 runes if they're very invested. They can sort of make new things up on the fly, potentially, and even make new spells as they go, based on them and the GM's sort of discretion. But you don't have an extensive, gigantic list of spells. And that's one way that you sort of keep the spellcaster creep in games down is by knowing what the spellcasters can do, and one way to do that is by limiting the spell list very, very specifically. So if I have a Hand of Lightning guy, I know what he can do, mostly combat, by the way. And if I have a guy who has the Portal rune, I know what he can do. And if I have the guy who knows the Vault of Secrets, I know what he can do. And that way, you can tailor things to be solved by the magic or not be solved by the magic. Like, is this guy going to get fly? I don't think so. I don't think this guy gets fly. He can teleport at some point, probably. I don't know why this is like that, but this is Google Docs, so I'm not going to touch it because it's... but he's not going to break certain challenges in the game, whereas this guy breaks... right, they break different sets of challenges in the game, but you know which challenges they break in the game. What I typically use the fatigue and investiture for are things that step on other people's toes, other characters' niches. So if you have a spell that picks locks, as a for instance, you can almost bet that that spell is going to have a fatigue cost. If you, right, I mean, except for combat, everybody's supposed to fight. But like if you break someone else's specific niche, typically I'm going to try to charge you for it and make it so that there's a reason you'd rather not use that spell and just let Jimmy pick the lock and only use your spell in a time of, desperate need. Or if Jimmy can't pick the lock or whatever, right? Because you are going to spend your spell levels because you are otherwise stepping on his toes. And then investiture, when you have to permanently burn a level, are for spells that step on the world's toes, if that makes any sense. So a spell that cures diseases would cost investiture because you've solved the world's problems effectively. If you had, maybe feeding one person, not a big deal, but if you had a spell that could feed 100 people, that probably costs you a permanent level because you've solved world hunger, like that kind of thing. And that's sort of what we use those things for. It's not even that the spell might be powerful, it's that I feel that the spell starts to edge into that territory of mages taking over and blobbing over every challenge. And yeah, so each rune is a small, tight, highly themed list of powers, and that's sort of what you get. I don't have a ton of them written up for this latest version of Bostonia. The old version has a lot, and there's a lot of wacky ones. But I think we're almost an hour, so I think we're going to stop here. So what I would ask is, do you have questions? Do you need me to do more stuff? Most of the game I think I covered, strangely enough. Combat, magic, and character creation, I feel mostly make up that's most of a role-playing game. We didn't talk about experience. I will give you the literally 1.5 minute experience tally. The experience rundown. When you use a skill, you get a check in it. You get 1 a night, potentially, even if you use the skill 18 times. There's a limit to, once you get so high in a skill, certain easy things or trivial things, we either don't roll anymore or you don't get any checks for those. You get free checks at the end of a night, and what a free check is, it allows you to put those in skills you didn't use, for instance, or to put more in skills that you did use if you want to raise those more quickly. I don't know what causes those O's to become bigger, but I'm down with it. Maybe I just do that. There you go. I'll just make it oh, it's capitalizing. Duh, I'm such an idiot. What are you doing, Word? Oh, I'm capitalizing for you. Thanks, Word. Let me turn Copilot on and see what it does to this document. At the end of the night, you take a 20-sided die. So once you spend your free checks and you go, okay, well, I used swords once, but I want to put more into swords. Done, right? There you go. At the end of the night, you're going to take each of these. You're going to roll a d20. And if you roll higher than your base value, this thing converts to an experience point. So let's say I rolled a 9. Bam. Experience point. Carouse. I rolled a 6. Nope, that goes away. That check is erased. Persuade. Nope. I rolled a 1. Nope, that goes away. But Physician, I rolled a 20. Done. Check. Swords, I rolled 10 and a 12. So anything I roll higher, I get an experience point. And then, depending on the speed that you want the campaign to go, X experience points then raises the base level by 1. In our game, it's 5. I want it to be slow and torturous to raise for them because I wanted this campaign to last for a couple years. You can easily tweak that to 3. Like you can make the game faster, make the game slower, how you want it to go. We just picked an arbitrary number, which in this case is 5. So once I get 4 of these, and then I got a check, and now I roll and convert it. It's converted. You erase them all. This goes to a 9. And then the final value, of course, goes up with it. There are no levels. Hit points and so on you don't get unless I give you a talent to buy them during the course of the game, which I have done over the course of the game. Same thing with your stats going up. There's no actual mechanism at the moment in Runebearer for stats to go up. I will occasionally give talents and say, oh, you guys solved a puzzle. Who wants +1 wit? All of those talents typically cost you free checks, which you can bank. You can save free checks to buy then the talents as they come. Or you can owe me free checks. You can say, oh, I'll give you the 5. The next 5 free checks, I don't get any. You typically get at least 1 free check a night, and then you get a bunch as an adventure ends or whatever. You might get a couple more as rewards. But yeah, you might have 3 or 4 free checks, and I go, who wants a +1 wit? And you go, yeah, I do. I'll take it. I'll erase my 4 free checks, and I'll give you 1. I'll be down 1, and then you up your wit to 16. And that's sort of how we manage experience and leveling. And I think that's it. So if you have questions, please ask. I would be happy to I'm happy to be vain about my game. I mean, it's my YouTube channel, I suppose. But yeah, if you have questions, please ask. We will go over rules a little bit, as we play the games and as these characters do all this, like we will do experience and you'll see it and so on and so forth. So that's where we're at. And hopefully you enjoyed this and hopefully it helps. And I will talk to you all later.